Now that leads us to this version of our simple little demo. We want to take this thing and turn it into an MVVM application with our single view that we're using. So that means we need to break up our view into a view and view model. Instead of putting code in the code behind, we put all the interaction logic and data manipulation into our view model. Let's step through it here. First, at the window level, we're still just placing statically an instance of our view into the container. Notice the customer ID has gone away here because for the purposes of this demo, we have to move it down a layer since all the data manipulation will be at the view model level. Next, we can go look at our view and see what's changed there from the previous demos. First off, if you had noticed before, there had been a loaded event wired up here on the user control root element. That's now gone. Probably first and foremost in terms of MVVM is that you can see we're newing up an instance of our view model statically here in the XAML parsing process. And the instance that's created there will then be set as the value on the data context of the view, satisfying the basic equation of MVVM. So this is where we're statically setting our customer ID for demo purposes in this case, but again, we'll get into ways to pass that dynamically later on. The next thing I'll focus on is if we move down to the individual data bindings. You can see they're not much different than they were before, but instead of just referencing, for example, first name and last name, they reference customer.firstname. So we're expecting that our view model, which is the overall data context for this view now, is exposing a single property called customer. That customer is a reference to a model object, so we're exposing a model object through our view model, allowing the bindings to dot down through it to its individual properties to grab the values in a nice declarative fashion. So that makes it very clear when you're reading this XAML as to exactly what this text box is bound against on the view model. Next, we drop down to our button, and we can see the button no longer does click handling into the code behind. The button uses a command object. So the command property is bound to another property exposed by our view model called saveCommand. We expect that to be an iCommand object, standard interface in .NET for commands, and it will be invoked whenever this button is clicked on. It can also be used to enable and disable this button. Finally, the last thing to focus on in the XAML here up at the top is this little chunk of code that may look a little strange to you if you've never been exposed to behaviors. What this is a chunk of code using the XAML behaviors library that you can add as a NuGet package. And I'm using one of the behaviors that's in that library named call method action. Call method action, as its name implies, is able to call a method on some object. So we specify what object do we want to invoke something on. Well, specifically what we're trying to do here is we still have that initialization that has to happen on load of the view. So we want to handle the loaded event in a declarative fashion here and dispatch it as a method call invocation against a method named loadCustomer that's on our view model, which is our data context. So a binding specified like this basically gets you a reference to the whole data context object, our view model. So this little chunk of code in a nutshell says go call the loadCustomer method on my view model when the loaded event of the view fires. We'll see how to get this all wired up through Blend quickly in a later module. That leads us to our view model, the focus of our MVVM world. And first off, its main job is to expose data so the view can present it, and that would be our customer data. So down here we see a customer property of type customer. We also see that we're implementing the iNotify property changed event. That's because we're not going to actually set that customer until our loaded handler, our loadCustomer method that's being called from the loaded event, gets invoked. And then we go and set that customer. By that point, construction is already done. The XAML parsing process is done. All the bindings have been evaluated. So we need to be able to signal the view that it should refresh its data binding. And that happens by firing the property changed event that's part of the iNotify property change interface. Next, we have our saveCommand property that we expose publicly and bound to, and that's being hooked up here in a constructor and pointing it to the actual handling method itself, which is the onSave handler. From there, you can see that both for the loadCustomer and the onSave method, we're doing task-based async again. So we're just wrapping our repository, our dependency, and we're invoking it with an await in front of it so that when it completes its asynchronous execution, we come back onto the UI thread and set the customer property of our view model with the result. Likewise with onSave. So that's a very simple MVVM in a nutshell example of a data entry form. Again, through the demos of the rest of the course, we'll get into more complicated views, nested hierarchies of views, navigation between views, and so on, and how those all come together with MVVM.